My name is Rhonda Marriott. People can hear? Oh, good. I'm a Ngangk woman. I was born in the Kimberley. I've grown up though on Murdoch country. I'm a nurse, I'm a midwife, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Ngangk Yira Institute for Change here at Murdoch University, and I'd like to welcome you all. I'd like to introduce our host. Guest. I'm delighted to be hosting Kath though this week. Professor Catherine Chamberlain is a Palawa woman, and she's a midwife, a researcher, and she's the leading investigator on the Replanting the Birthing Trees project that we're going to speak about today to you. And it's really lovely to have you here, Kath.
Thanks, Rhonda. It's really lovely to be here. And hello to everyone.
The tree that's in the photo, which is behind me, and I'm assuming that photo is still there, is symbolic because birthing trees have been used by women, by Aboriginal women for many thousands of years across many, but not all, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And birthing trees represent a sacred place where women and babies go to seek a sense of safety and shelter and to be cared for during that important time of birth. And it reminds me a little bit of a film that Jade and I were involved in another research project a number of years ago. And one of the Injibandi women, senior women in that film, talked about the importance of trees and is actually shown in the film in front of a tree, and the importance of that for birthing. So it's still very, very much a present, important process for Aboriginal women, and it's still very meaningful for us as well. We've drawn on this analogy in the Replanting the Birthing Trees project because we're very excited to talk to you about. And the project aims to transform compounding cycles of intergenerational trauma and harm to positive and reinforcing cycles into intergenerational nurturing and recovery for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents and babies. Over the next 50 minutes or so, and we've got about 26 slides, so I'm hoping it's not going to go too long. And I'm going to try and talk fast. But over the next little while, Kath and I are going to talk to you, and I'm sure that there will be questions or comments that you'd like to raise along the way, and I'd invite you to think about those and hold on to them until the end, so that we can have a really good and rich discussion at the end. But through the presentation, Kath and I are going to talk to you about the background to the project and why it's needed. We're going to point to some of the background research that's informed the proposal and will continue to inform the project as it's developed. And we're going to provide you an overview of our activities as we're seeing them now, and our deliverables as we're also seeing them now over the next 4 years. And I know from our conversations so far that they will shift a little bit, but I don't think that they will shift hugely. Okay, the artwork that's on this slide has been completed by Shawana Andrews, and I hope I have not said her name incorrectly. She's one of the investigators on this project, and she developed this artwork from previous work that informed this proposal, which was the Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future project. And it represents the values and the aspirations for this work of, and I'm going to read the quote that you probably can't see, that's underneath the drawing itself. A father, mother and child wearing possum skin cloaks and looking to the ancestors and past generations. The parents are connected with a songline which gives them strength. The stones below represent a strong foundation, and the stitching on the cloaks represent the relational connectedness of Aboriginal people and worldview. We will in time develop new artwork for this new project, and that will complement then where the project began in the Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future, but also depict where we're hoping to go, which is growing and being informed by community consultation. Before we have any discussions about trauma, it's important to recognise that this trauma affects many of us, and these discussions, either in a setting like this or with your clients, can very easily trigger responses to your own experiences, which can come up as fear, panic, vulnerability, feeling disconnected. It can be expressed physically as constricted or rapid breathing, increased heart rate, sweating, all that flight and fright response. If it happens, just remember that these are natural physiological responses, and you can bring your system back into balance by using a range of practical strategies. These include grounding yourself, using the senses, for example, looking at 3 things around you. What 2 noises can you hear? 1 thing that you can feel, and remember to breathe. Always remind myself, the very first time I did a lecture, I had to remind myself to breathe. Being mindful of these sensations and releasing them is really important. And please feel free to get up and leave if you need to, if the discussion or the slides become too uncomfortable. And we're happy to talk to you about that as well later. These are all part of a normal part of working in this trauma space. And it's important for us to remember that as we go through this project, that's certainly going to happen. And experiencing a trigger is not unusual, and it can be an opportunity for growth and healing. Okay, so next slide. So let's talk about the project background, which will help explain why we're doing some of this work, and I hope it's informative for you as well. I love that photo. It's important to remember that prior to colonisation in 1788, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and it's different times across the nation, had adapted and thrived for at least 60,000 years on this vast continent that we live on. And available evidence suggests that in 1788, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not physically, socially, and emotionally healthier than most Europeans at that time because of the way they lived, living on the land, and any stresses. This state of well-being, which was centred around connectedness, did not happen by accident. There were over 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries across this land, each with sophisticated laws and systems and ways of being, as well as a thriving art and spiritual culture. New parents were supported using principles such as grandmother's law and the safety and relational development of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who've been fostered within systems of kinship and country for millennia. Specific cultural practices to foster physical, social, cultural and spiritual well-being started before birth, as we know, and continued throughout the lives of our ancestors, their ancestors, until death. Thank you. By successive ways, it's very disconcerting not being able to see that. So that's why I have to keep turning around. By successive waves of violence, and I apologise that this slide is probably busy and a little bit small, so hopefully my narrative will help make sense of this slide. Successive ways of violence have been associated with colonisation, starting with direct conflict or overt violence, then covert violent structural attacks directly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, with destructive and devastating government policies, including the stolen generations, which is not new for many of us, unfortunately, with the removal of way over 100,000 Aboriginal children from their families, and unfortunately continues in many other covert ways nowadays. Children were forcibly removed from their parents, even from hospitals shortly after birth, which is an ongoing legacy for those of us who are working in perinatal care services today or in child protection. The front line of colonial wars in Australia have been on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. Finally, ongoing psychosocial domination continues to restrict access to the essential social determinants for a healthy, happy life for Aboriginal people. The image on this slide is from the recent, I think we're talking about the next one, are we not? No, it's not the same one. Is from a recent 2020 BMJ article, which highlights the effects of war on children, starting in utero, and then a range of impacts on child health and wellbeing that cause toxic stress, and if repeated, prolonged and not mitigated, can lead to complex trauma and physical, social and emotional challenges through to adulthood. And we know very well that the ongoing effects can be hidden as well. All of this results in intergenerational effects that are due to the impact on relational development and capacity to nurture children. Professor Judy Atkinson's seminal work on this is outlined in Trauma Trails, which describes intergenerational trauma impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in detail. Have I talked about that? It really is important to understand the basic physiology of trauma, just like understanding the physiology of labour and birth. This slide is rather simplistic explanation in the short time that we have today, but essentially protective fight, flight and freeze responses are essential for our survival as humans. Once this system is activated in response to one threat, it can be more readily activated by anything associated with the initial threat, be they smells, sounds, or things in the environment. And it's not generally linked to rational or conscious thought, especially if it has happened in childhood before conceptual thinking capacity is fully developed. Sometimes we're not even aware of what we're responding to because we don't have a conscious memory of that. So these fright, flight and freeze responses are about 600 times faster than conscious thought in the frontal lobe, which is pushed offline when the amygdala is activated. And this can have the effect of people feeling like they're going crazy as they and their body are responding quicker than they can think, and they are often not aware of understanding why they're having these responses. So it's like not an out-of-body response, but I can't control this and I don't understand what the hell's going on. Trying to bring the frontal lobe back online and grounding yourself in the present is really important, and it's an important part of trying to regulate triggers. And there's a rationale behind asking somebody to count to 10 and to try and calm them down when they're angry. I wish someone would do that with road rage, and also using grounding strategies. I drove in the car with my husband yesterday and I think, road rage. Driving in peak hour traffic might be akin to this. But when we're small, you don't have any rational thinking about this. And many small children can't fight or run. So freezing is a common protective action in response to childhood trauma. Can we just ask everyone to mute their microphones, please? Many thanks. Understanding attachment is also essential to understanding trauma. Again, it's a survival mechanism. As humans, we are dependent on our caregivers for a long time. And developing attachment with caregivers increases chances of survival. In times of distress, an infant relies on support from their parent or caregivers to regulate. If a parent withdraws or the response is confusing or hostile, this creates an internal conflictual paradox within the child's developing brain as the flight, fright, and freeze defence responses to run away or play dead or whatever are being activated at the same time with the child's attachment systems. So it's a very confusing thing that they actually don't have language for necessarily. So it's very much up to us to be aware of that. Okay, the next one. Pregnancy, birth and the early years of life is often called the first 2000 days. And I'm not telling you anything that all of you don't know, although some may not know that. And this is a very critical time for children. The foundations for physical and mental health, resilience, well-being and spiritual connections to country and family are formed during this really important period of development. Over the past 20 to 30 years, Western knowledge of child development has advanced to include a number of understandings, including how early experiences are essential for building brain connections. And this includes things like play, stories, being tactile. Environmental influences can affect if and how genes are expressed. And early adversity has negative impacts on brain development, including emotional control, cognitive growth, and stress responses. Early adversity can change the timing of critical periods of brain development, impacting the plasticity or the malleability of developmental processes that are driven by experiences in the child and family lives. Much of the international evidence about what the child needs for optimal development and how to turn the science into practice at scale internationally is outlined in this 2016 An Early Development series in The Lancet. The Healing Foundation have recently developed online training and an animation on child development that's been narrated by Jack Charles, which includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concepts, and it's worth having a look if anyone has the time, and we can perhaps send the link to people as well, and perhaps pop the link in the chat for you. All of this background has been developed in the free Emerging Minds online course as well. And I'm this one, yes. Okay. I want to also emphasise that there's a huge amount of epidemiological data that shows how the individual effects play out at a population level to show a compounding and intergenerational effect. Again, probably not anything that's new to any of you. It's the compounding features that explain why this is so hard to address and why we really need to invest in major reform to push back on these drivers. The WHO European Review of Social Determinants of Health provide a framework that's shown in this slide for conceptualising the compounding intergenerational effects of complex trauma. Firstly, a history of successive waves of exposure to violence leads to a higher rate of exposure to violence in communities. This figure then shows how a range of socio-ecological influences compound the effects of violence at individual, relational, community and societal levels, including poverty, poor quality, overcrowded housing, lack of educational opportunities, and we can go on and on. All of this leads to increased health risks and decreased responsiveness to many preventative health strategies, including some parenting support programs. This causes direct and indirect effects through impacts on other social determinants on health, and data from the Rochester Health Study shows clear effects on economic prosperity. Then there are intergenerational effects, and you can see the importance of the perinatal period in this whole model, which Kath will talk more about in a moment. Finally, in all of these factors, we have a compounding intergenerational effect on health inequities, both at a societal level and between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples and within Aboriginal communities. And I know that's a lot of information, but I think it's really important to have gone over it because we can't assume that we're all across all of this. I'd like to hand over to Kath now, and I'd like to grab a drink of water, please.
Thank you, Rhonda, and thank you, everyone. It's a real honour to be here on Whadjuk Country and meeting and talking with you. We feel very, very privileged to be here. So to carry on from Rhonda, and you said that also beautifully, thank you. So the perinatal period is really, really important for parents who have experienced child maltreatment in the past or are experiencing complex trauma for three main reasons. And I know many of you are familiar with all of this. But firstly, there's this convergence of risk factors for experiencing distress, trauma-related distress. And you can, going through that background, you can probably understand why, but listed here, there are so many reasons. It's almost like a natural stress test in pregnancy for anybody experiencing complex trauma or previous trauma. We've got pre-existing mental or family illness that could be an issue, historical trauma, adverse childhood experiences can be stirred up at this time as people are reminded of that as they become parents themselves. We know there's increased risks of family violence at this time. There can be previous birth trauma that can also be stirred up at this time. People can experience racism in healthcare services. There can also be lateral violence within our own communities. It's increased housing instability with pregnancy, financial insecurity. It can be a time of social isolation and other caring responsibilities. And then you throw in the sleep deprivation and also all the natural hormonal responses that happen during pregnancy, which are protective to help us protect that beautiful, precious baby. But that actually makes us more sensitive to trauma responses. So it's really important that you know, we understand when people are coming in that all of this can happen. Despite all of that, it's really and to understand if people are having those responses, what it is, and to have that in context and to be able to respond appropriately. But despite all of that, the really positive and exciting thing that's clearly emerged from the evidence is that this transition to parenthood offers a unique life course opportunity to transform those cycles and to have recovery even after severe trauma. There's been qualitative studies by Favre et al. That have found that post-traumatic changes during the perinatal period were more likely to be exclusively positive, whereas at other times during the life, those changes could be a mix of positive and negative changes. Leonie Segal and colleagues have argued that this positive strength-based focus during this optimistic time really has the potential to disrupt these cycles and to transform them into virtuous cycles that contain these positively reinforcing elements. So that's why in the background work to this, one of the background projects to this new project, we called it Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future, because it's nurturing that love that the baby bring into the world that helps to rewire some of those trauma responses that are happening in the brain. It's quite magic how nature works sometimes. And it promotes healing through a process sometimes referred to as earned security. So as well as being a critical time for infant brain development, increasing evidence shows it's also a critical time, this is for the baby, it's also a critical time for neurological development and malleability within the brain of parents as well. So there's increasing evidence that this is a time when parents are more likely to recover, particularly mothers, but also emerging evidence around what's happening for dads as well. So from a public health perspective, when we look across the life course, there's few other opportunities for healing from that relational complex trauma as strong as this transition to parenting. And we've seen that in, not here in Australia, but longitudinal studies that have been done in America among youth that have been in detention centres that are possibly the most traumatised people in the whole community, where they're fairly terrible and depressing reading, looking at their life after, you know, through detention, before detention and after detention. But there's one positive bit in the data that's really clear, where many people can get off those pretty awful trajectories, and that is having a baby. It really is a chance where even people with severe trauma can heal. However, this requires a highly skilled and well-supported workforce. And this is where we know that we've been telling grandma to suck eggs a little bit with this audience, probably, as most of you work in this sector. It's a really important time. We don't need to convince you of that. The Centre of Perinatal Excellence did this survey in a few years ago, showing that Aboriginal people, 98% of Aboriginal people working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents rated trauma, stress and grief as either significant or very significant. However, only 43%, or sorry, almost half, 43%, did not feel confident that their organisations could support parents' recovery during this critical time. And this is really important. So this is the gap that we're really wanting to address, and effective community-led strategies to transform these intergenerational cycles of trauma to cycles of nurturing recovery and improved wellbeing for parents and baby are really urgently needed as a foundation for closing the gap. It's definitely hard, but we really believe that the perinatal workforce is really a bunch of incredibly skilled workers, and that we are really well placed to be able to build on this important foundations and to develop that expertise. So I'll just talk briefly about some of the projects, or one of the projects that's informed this proposal. So going on to the next stage. So this new proposal brings together existing streams of research under the governance of the National Health Leadership Forum and the Coalition of Peaks. So it's aligned to the new national agreement on closing the gap to address critical and documented gaps in perinatal care, to drive health system reform and establish a transformative shift in health policies and practice. This will enable scale-up of culturally grounded, safe, holistic, trauma-integrated, transdisciplinary continuity of care in the first 2,000 days to ensure that all babies have the best possible start to life. In doing so, we hope the First Nations parents will be supported once again to achieve their dreams for a happy, safe and healthy family during this abundant country that we share. So these existing research programs include the Birthing on Noongar Budja project and Baby Coming You Ready project here, led by Professor Rhonda Marriott and team that are here today, and the family violence prevention programs led by Professor Marcia Langton and her team, and also many other, with there's 48 investigators on this project, many of whom bring a lot of expertise, including the Bagaluk program led by Professor Helen McLaughlin, and the Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future project, which I work on with the team here. And we're also, at the time we submitted this, hoping to collaborate. This was one of 3 projects that were announced in the budget this year, and we want to collaborate with the other 2 programs that were funded at the same time, the Birthing on Country work led by Professor Yvette Rowe and her team, and the Birthing in Our Community program. So just going on to talk briefly about the Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future project, which draws on some of the background that was presented. And the aims of this project is to bring together the emerging Western evidence and the millennia-old wisdom of communities around fostering social and emotional wellbeing to co-design acceptable, safe and feasible perinatal strategies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents experiencing complex trauma. So we've been working for the past 4 years, since 2018, and we started in a workshop with developing this conceptual model, applying these important principles with a focus on 4 main domains. So awareness of complex trauma, how do we foster that within the perinatal care system to minimise the risk of re-traumatisation and triggering within healthcare. Safe recognition, so how do if there's any assessment of complex trauma, how can that be done so that any benefits outweigh risks? And importantly, that, of course, support that needs to be available. It became really clear when we were talking about support that we need to, think about support more broadly than just clinical psychological care. And when we talk about assessment, we need to ensure that it includes assessment of concepts important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we need yeah, we really need to make sure that there's safety around any of these assessment tools. There's some links to some published papers on these slides for anyone who wants more detail, and on our website. So just to go on, I won't go through this, but this was a massive co-design process that we went through using intervention mapping and participatory-based action research with communities. So the intervention mapping is 6 steps, and the first 4 co-design steps are represented here. And it's probably a bit small for people to read, but you can see there's research activities across the top, the workshops that are being conducted, which we just had workshop 4 last week, and then in the middle of the participatory action research cycles that reflect on the research and plan for the step ahead. So there's a load of publications that we can share these slides with, that you can read up more about the protocol, emotional safety framework. We started the sessions with elders, discussion groups, papers about safe recognition, including some of the advocacy work that spun off from this around supporting Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander families to stay together from the start, and addressing that elephant in the room, which is the intersection of child protection services in what we do. So all of the research confirms what we've outlined in this paper here, that this is a unique opportunity to transform that compounding cycle of hurt into a reinforcing cycle of nurturing. And again, this is one of, oh gosh, sorry, should try and turn that off. Apologies. Around parents' 3 interdependent elements: parents' connectedness, well-being, and the transition to parenting. So Shawana has drawn an illustrative description of the theoretical supposition here. So the grasses, weave, and basket are representative of the cumulative nature of connectedness, well-being, and parenting, respectively. The grasses or reeds from which baskets are made grow from the country and represent connectedness to place and culture. The weave facilitates the grasses' transformation into a basket, and it relies upon the generational, transferred Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and cultural practices. Without knowing how to weave, a basket cannot be made, and well-being of culture and community and kinship networks are represented here. The basket is the product of the cumulative knowledge and practices, and it's only whole and effective when all of the prior stages are achieved. So I might, I'll just move on to the next step now, and the pilot project. We're currently working on a pilot project in collaboration with VACA in Morwell and La Trobe Hospital around those final steps of the intervention mapping model, around program production, implementation, evaluation, to translate these understandings into perinatal care, and addressing the problem of a lack of acceptable, effective perinatal strategies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents experiencing complex trauma. And now I'll pass back to Professor Marriott to talk about some of the work here in the other programs. There's a lot of different parts of it.
Thanks very much, Kath. You mentioned the Birthing on Ngangk project earlier, and some of our other projects that are going to inform this. And this slide is about our Birthing on Ngangk project, which has concluded, and we started in 2014. I'd like to acknowledge Valerie Archie, who's in the room with us as well. Valerie is a Bindra Palaku woman, a mother, a midwife, and an artist. And Valerie designed our Birthing on Ngangk, and a grandmother. Valerie designed our Birthing on Ngangk logo, and Valerie, I really do thank you for being brave to create a contemporary form that you did at the time. I know you're a little bit, I don't know if I want to make it too contemporary, but it's been an incredibly distinctive logo. And I think, you know, for me, it represents what we were hoping to achieve, and that was to understand the impact on up and coming Aboriginal mums in their experiences in maternity care. And we did seek through the project to understand that impact of fragmented maternity care that are experienced by, in the main, Aboriginal women who were birthing at that time or had birthed over a number of years on Whadjuk country, urban Whadjuk country. And from the project, we had a number of recommendations that were distilled into 3 key ones that we hoped would bring about some change. We interviewed a number of Aboriginal women and midwives, 74 plus in each of those groups. So it was a very, very large project. And you can imagine with a large project like that, we had many, many, many recommendations, which with the help of some very skilled policy and service providers who were partnered with us in the project, worked with us to distill those down into 3. So firstly, we recommended that advocacy to improve service delivery. And that is still an essential process. We wanted to bring about change in the WA maternity health workforce, and the outcome of that was that we were able to have a principal Aboriginal nursing and midwifery advisor established. So that position was appointed in 2020, and Deborah Jacobs is in that position, and the position will help develop workforce strategies and service delivery models. And the learning from doing that was that a recommitment to the full scope of that very important advisory position and role with appropriate decision-making processes enabled capacity for an expert group, internal and external, to provide advice to her and to bring around her a system of and group of people who are able to provide that ongoing expert advice. The third recommendation we made was about changing maternity care education in Western Australia. And the outcome of this was the development of a beautiful book, which is titled Ngangk, Mother's Stories, and that was released last year in August. And it was funded by WA Health, and I acknowledge the wonderful input from Wendy Casey's office and from the Nursing and Midwifery office in that. The book was edited by Auntie Doreen Nelson, myself and Tracy Ribel, and it contains the birthing stories of 12 wonderful elders and senior women. And we're so thrilled that they trusted us to be able to commit their stories to being in a very public domain. 500 of those copies have been made freely available to schools of nursing across the country. And in particular, we wanted those to go into midwifery and maternity care areas, maternity care units across Western Australia in particular. 700 plus copies have been sold via our distributor, who is Fremantle Press, and the book is available in an online electronic version, which I think is great for midwifery students. The learning from this was that we had incredible enthusiastic responses, and it really demonstrated the need for more publicly available knowledge. When we started that Birthing on Ngangk project, we were asked by midwives to produce a brochure. Just give us a brochure to tell us how we should be interacting with Aboriginal women. I think what we've achieved through this book and the education that sits within it, that's drawn from the stories and is woven by the wonderful Chrissy Parry and her experience, is that it's a legacy for not only families, but it's a legacy for midwives and for future generations of midwives. We do need to bring about more change, and that's an incredible learning for us, an incredible hard learning at times, and we need to continue to strive to improve the understanding about cultural birthing practices, not only birthing on country, but birthing on country for urban women who are birthing on their own country, but often in maternity services, and how to make those culturally safe. The next one, I don't think you mentioned this one, but this is Topsy, which is a project, a new project that we have been working on that is hopefully going to inform where we move forward with replanting the birthing trees as well. Topsy is a tool to measure parenting self-efficacy and was developed by Professor Catherine in the UK. It's been used extensively in many, many countries across the globe now, and is used within Australia as well. And if you're wanting to have a look at Sally Kendall's work that started in 2005 and led to the development of the tool, and if you just look up Topsy, just under the acronym TOPSE online, you'll be able to see her UK website and look at the information about all of the domains. Theoretically, Topsy is grounded in Albert Bandura's theory of self-efficacy, and Sally went through a very, very complicated and rigorous scientific process to look at validating the tool. And I think the proof is in the pudding for that, in that it's been translated in so many languages and is used in so many different circumstances, to be able to look at parenting programs and to see whether parents actually feel changed. The thing I love about Topsy is that it's parents thinking about themselves and their own journey and reflecting on their own learnings. So they're not comparing themselves to other parents, which is never a good place to be. Remembering my time of changing nappies when my son was quite young. Okay, so Topsy is something that we worked with Jean Efron, who was an honours student, to see whether it could be adapted and would be acceptable for use with Aboriginal parents, because it hadn't been adapted. And the parents that we brought together and the services who work with parents that we brought together were able to make a lot of recommendations around how the language could be adapted and changed to be more acceptable and more understandable. And we're now poised, ready to look at a validation of that, which we hope to be able to do through the Replanting the Birthing Trees project, but also another project with a postdoc student. And I think it will be a very exciting thing. Okay, moving on to next one. Thank you. So there have been many co-design projects that we have looked at, and I just want to remind everybody that the work that we do is co-designed, and we often hear the phrase, nothing about us without us, but that really does involve input from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we all work with across the country, Aboriginal people in particular here in Western Australia, elders, mothers, fathers, practitioners, and people who work with Aboriginal people as well. And that's important for us and important for the next project that I want to talk about, that Dr. Jane Coates and her team have been working on now for a long time. This is a really important project that you mentioned earlier, Baby Coming You Ready. It's one of the range of digital innovations that have the potential to transform maternal health and wellness in Australia. Baby Coming You Ready is a therapeutic, culturally safe and strengths-based program that engages parents and practitioners on multiple issues in plain language. It's got touchscreen visual prompts on iPads and Aboriginal voiceovers to guide both users, mothers-to-be and midwives through a range of specified domains of inquiry. And Baby Coming You Ready is now being developed for use on mobile phones as well. It's done. It's done. which is wonderful, because it makes it more portable and increases its reach. Baby Coming You Ready is designed to develop trust and engagement and to identify and enhance strengths, and to understand the contextual factors in the life of the mother-to-be and how these might impact an assessment of risk. Baby Coming You Ready encourages open reflection and self-evaluation and fosters understanding for both users. The additional Baby Coming You Ready rubric has been designed for fathers, further supporting strong family systems, and we haven't quite got to that point yet, but it's very much on the horizon. Because fathers are a key part of parenting. Baby Coming You Ready is a practical innovation solution to overcoming the many evidence-based barriers. And I won't go into all of those, but we know that there are many, many, many of those. And it uses motivational interviewing, stages of change, brief interventions, smart goal settings with mums, and guided mental health examination. And we know the importance of this in relation to the current standard tool that's used, which is Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Screen, which many of us relied on. Okay, the Baby Coming You Ready assets include training to importantly nurture trauma-informed practice, support innocent inquiry, and to cultivate didiri or deep listening in the use of yarning to gather the parents' stories. And again, Valerie's work has developed this trauma tree for the training to illustrate the complexities across a lifetime that can grow and lead to overwhelming impact on many Aboriginal women. I also acknowledge that there are many other programs, and you mentioned a number of these, Marcia Langton's work on family violence, and Jane and her team have also looked at family violence within Baby Coming You Ready, and Professor McLaughlin's work on Baverock, as well as name a few. And now I'll pass back to Kath to talk about replanting the birthing trees.
Thank you.
Which we're excited about.
Doing a bit of tag teaming, which is nice. So the aim of the Replanting the Birthing Trees project, as we said before, is to transform the compounding cycles of intergenerational trauma and harm to positively reinforcing cycles of intergenerational nurturing and recovery for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents and babies. It's an important opportunity that we've got with this grant and with the other two grants that were funded through the same budget to really work together and make sure that our the outcome, what we're doing, is more than the sum of its parts. Okay, and so our objective with Replanting the Birthing Trees is to combine our ways of knowing, being and doing with prior Aboriginal-led participatory co-design research and practice evidence, which we call GARMA in this, so bringing together those two types of evidence to implement and evaluate community-led, holistic, transdisciplinary continuity of care with 7 perinatal services in 2 jurisdictions for starters, so Western Australia and Victoria. So we'll just go through that conceptual model now and show you. Thank you. So we might just do a little bit of clicking to go through each one of these. So the important part of this is really the governance, and it's really nice to see Lyndall online today, who started at NACCHO. So this work will be governed by the National Health Leadership Forum peak body representatives. So Rhonda and I will be reporting, remembering that we're researchers and this is about implementation. So we'll have that community controlled governance with the representatives of those community controlled organisations that will help provide guidance for this work that we do, and an embedded policy officer at NACCHO to help inform that scale up. Thank you. And then we've got the other important bit is the using implementation with the diffusion of science and grounded in the rich Indigenous knowledges, as we've said. And then we'll just go through there's 6 main work streams that we're starting out here from the roots. So the first one is supporting Aboriginal parents to stay together from the start. So really addressing that intersection with child protection services and making sure that we're minimising the harm and increasing safety there. The sturdy trunk is around the continuity of care that we know is really critical to establishing relationships The supportive branches is all the training and support and education for service providers. And then in the leaves, we've got all of the other creative stuff that can come and be built on, which will be set up in a resource repository. There's support, if lots of people doing amazing support programs, so how to build and grow that, and the assessment tools that we've talked through quickly. So I think we're running short of time, so we'll just flick through some of these deliverables. So in year one,
maybe what we want to cover in year one.
just one. So this year, this is to put everyone's mind at ease that really this year we're focusing on recruitment, governance, so establishing the Garma group, applying for ethics and doing all the boring admin stuff so that we can all get set up, and coming and talking to you today is a really important part of that. And then we might just flick through those other years and just acknowledge all of the people. This is a massive project, and this is really just the foundational investigators and partners. And it's a busy slide, but that's just the reality of how many people are involved, and that is growing.
And it's a complex project, and I think it's important to honour that.
So thank you. And I think now we'll